Hello, everyone. It's nice to be back here. I feel like that's a hard act to follow. My brief essentially here is to kind of you heard a lot about happiness, you've heard about the science of happiness and so on. And my brief is to sort of talk about it's from a contemplative side, and specifically a Buddhist side for me. But not just a Buddhist sort of rant, but how and why that understanding might be relevant to us here in the 21st century. And the easiest way to do that, or perhaps the most powerful way, the easiest way to get that across is to sort of just start with a story and walk you through how I ended up here and the research that we're doing right now up in Queensland and what's happening there. So the story sort of starts basically on a park bench in a place called Queen's Park in Toronto, Canada, in April of 1995. And I had been in the city about a week. It was cold. Actually, I learned later that it wasn't cold. But I'd come from Queensland, I thought it was cold. So I'm on a park bench, and I'm experiencing all the physiology, you might say the symptomology, of what we would call anxiety. And it was sort of significant to me at the time because only a year or so earlier my life had kind of derailed as an exact result of this, right? And so back in that time I was living in Brisbane, and I'd sort of, it was the mid-90s, I was a 20-something-year-old male, didn't ask for any help, which is sort of the demographic that this works for. And so what I did is actually I did a bit of exercise, saved a bit of money, and I moved to the other side of the world to a city where I didn't know anyone and had never been before, which it's worth saying here is not the ideal treatment for anxiety, if you think about it. So it comes back to this point. So back to the park bench. I'm sitting here, I've been in town about a week. I had every reason to be a bit nervous. I had a one-way ticket. I didn't have a lot of money. And what makes it sort of interesting and still sticks with me now, and in fact informs kind of everything I've done since then till now, is that I was kind of enjoying it. I kind of liked it. And it was fascinating to me because, it felt like back then I used to surf quite a lot, or I went snowboarding in Canada. It was kind of like doing a snowboard run that was kind of harder than I really should, or paddling out in waves that were bigger than I should go out in. It was this sort of stress, but it was kind of fun. And it's really interesting, for me at least, right? Because, how is it that the same physiology, the same experience that I had previously, just a year or so ago, that actually prevented me from going out, right? Like it kind of derailed my career, I had problems with friends and everything, relationships and so on. How is it the same basic experience now is kind of enjoyable in a new context? And the question to me just had to be asked. It had to be asked. So I looked around, I popped around to sort of the Zen Center out in Toronto. I did a few things, but unfortunately for me, things went really well. I got into university, I did a music performance degree, a jazz performance degree, which is why I was there. I met great people, I had a girlfriend, had a car, I had everything. It was great, actually. And, until one day it wasn't, right? Same thing happened though this time, the sort of that physiology I was quite familiar with, that anxiety that statistically speaking, many of you will have experienced as well, arose, but this time I wanted to be interested. What should I do? So now I really investigated this question because this has happened to me in the past, and I kind of got through. I'd had this experience before, and it was kind of invigorating and helpful. So what can I do about it? Because I wanted to know how much of my experience, how much of me, how much did I put myself through that in the past? And how much of it was sort of done to me from the outside world, which is what I had previously believed. So I poked around, and there's a lot of Tibetans live in Toronto. There's a big refugee community there. And in full disclosure, there was literally a Tibetan Buddhist meditation center, literally, I'm not making this up, across the road from my favorite pub. And I used to go there and watch hockey with my friends and hang out. And so one day I swung by and I picked up a brochure and read up on it. And so I went, and what happened, I guess, is that I learned the meditation practices, the basic meditation practices they were teaching, and the theory behind them both. And much to my absolute astonishment, it kind of worked. At least for me, right? Things got better. I kind of sidestepped this anxiety thing that was coming at me. My relationships got better. My focus got better. My sort of overall concern for other people improved. All these sorts of things happened that I had not expected, right? So I did what anyone, any normal person would do in a situation like that, is that I sold everything and I moved to India. And and in India, I lived up in the northern Himalayan region where the Dalai Lama lives. I learned to speak, read, and write Tibetan so I could study directly from them rather than have to go through translators. And in doing so, I guess I was unaware of, at that time, the kind of movement of research and meditation that was going on in the West, this sort of modern popularization of mindfulness and meditation that was happening. I was unaware of it and frankly didn't care, where I was. But what it means is my training was really kind of traditional, right? Like I went across and I learned the language and I spoke and I asked the questions and away we went. And so I think there's a few things, when I say meditation to you now, all of you have, the idea of what that means in your minds, of course, and there'll be a really broad variety of what that meaning is in this room alone. So I thought, well, maybe there's a few things that I learned when I'm there that sort of differentiate that approach from sort of what you might be familiar with and how I'm using it right now in research that we're writing up as we speak. So here's a few things. Firstly, Buddhism is super goal-oriented, right? This was a surprise to me, right? Super goal-oriented. There are these goals. And there's these sort of, I call them in my thesis, scientifically unverifiable goals. Enlightenment, liberation, and so on, yeah? And then there are sort of ways to get, little sort of way stations along the way, if you like, ways to get there. So in Buddhism, there's none of this all about the journey stuff. You know what I mean? Like you go across to the West and you deal with Tibet and say, no, it's about the journey. They're like, no. It's not like there's a path. And the reason there's a path is you get to the destination as fast as possible. So people who are really goal-oriented, who like ticking things off to-do lists, like my wife, really respond to that. So goal-oriented. Meditation, in the word is so fraught as we translate it from, say, Sanskrit or Tibetan. It's basically thought of as contemplative technology is the term I use. Yeah. And what the technology is for, the technology is specifically to get you along that path. That's what it's for, right? So you use this technology in a way, we'll talk about in a moment, to get to these goals. Also, just a brief note on mindfulness, again, especially in the Tibetan tradition, but in Buddhism generally, mindfulness isn't the end game by any means. It never has been, never will be. Mindfulness is a tool. You develop mindfulness in order to do other stuff with it. It's a skill you learn in order to do other things. And that's missed a lot, I find, in the modern popularization where there's this idea that mindfulness is the sort of goal. It's not. Improving your mindfulness skills will help you better use the technologies to get you to where you're going, right? And then what you actually do with it is you apply it to things. There are these applications of mindfulness, we call them. Sometimes kind of poorly translated as foundations of mindfulness, you might have heard some of you, but this is applications. It's like once you've got mindfulness skills, what do you do? There's all sorts of things you can do, but the thing that is most interesting to someone like me, and we'll come to what I'm using in the research we're doing up in Queensland, the one that's most interesting to me is that it's designed specifically to help you examine, right? Help you examine how much of your experience in your life comes from your side and how much comes from outside. Yeah, that is to say, in the interaction of me and everything else that's here, how much of it am I just accurately perceiving and how much of it am I kind of making up? And this should be of interest. Cognitive psychology, neuroscience, even quantum physics are all on board with this, that the amount of stuff that is coming from your side is at the very least, without being controversial, a lot. A lot. So you can see when I come back to the park bench idea, this is really important. When I stumbled across this in my studies, I was like, wait, I've seen this actually. I stumbled across this exact thing. I didn't have a word for it, but they do, right? In Tibetan, in English, we talk about it as dereification is a term, or cognitive fusion, these terms. And what it is taking that mental activity and treating it as real. And you can imagine, once I treat it as real, then that drives my behavior and away I go. So we've got all these things, up and running. So I've learned all this stuff, and at some point I come back to Australia. I come back to Sydney, actually, where I work translating at Vajrayana Institute. I do a degree in Sanskrit and psychology while I'm here. And when I moved up to Queensland, I started teaching a little bit on stress reduction and burnout prevention for the paramedic science students who were doing their placements, their third years doing their placements up at Sunshine Coast University. And that was really interesting, went really well, had lots of discussions. And I sort of bumbled my way into a research project that became the PhD that I'm working on now. And what we've done basically is this. We've taken an existing sort of course, we've pared it back. This course is called Cultivating Emotional Balance. If anything I'm saying is of interest to you, then I recommend you maybe look into that or get in touch with me. And Cultivating Emotional Balance, because we're using kind of a traditional approach, I guess, of these meditation practices, because it combines a traditional meditation approach with a modern sort of psychology-based understanding of emotions and mental health, and we combine these two things together, right? And so we have to, because I want to do it, I want to take as much as I can out of these contemplative sort of pool of knowledge. I want to take this stuff out of the Buddhist sort of domain where it's kind of hoarded away and see if we can sort of get it working in a scientific sort of, and I'm not the only one doing this, but that's sort of what we're working on. So we need goals. So in CEB, in Cultivating Emotional Balance, we come up with some goals. We say, okay, when I work with people, I say, well, first and foremost, let's try to see if we can get you in control of everything you say and do, no matter how emotional you are. Here's one. Say it again. We like to, the first thing we work on is try to make sure you're in control of what you say and do when you're emotional. And we can do this, right? In fact, that's the starter goal. Yeah. There are other goals, of course, depending on who we're working with. We can talk about decreases in anxiety and depression symptomology, which is what my research is, or you can look into measurable levels of stable well-being and mental health and these sorts of things as well. But it's important there's some kind of goal, right? It's not about the journey, it's about the goal when you're working with me and you're working with CEB, okay? So we've got that all right, and then we need an application. Mindfulness has applications. If you're going to teach people mindfulness, you don't just have them sitting around being mindful. Not from a traditional contemplative approach. You do something with it. What do? Let's apply it to emotions. Why would we do that? Well, it's interesting because to oversimplify, then if you were thinking about something like anxiety, you're talking about, of course, it's much more varied than this, but you're talking about high intensity, high frequency experiences of fear emotional episodes of different varieties. So, if we're talking about the symptomology or the symptoms of anxiety, same thing for sadness and depression, and there's others, then rather than sort of play in the symptom space, let's look in the emotion space, which are kind of having a real impact. Yeah. In fact, if you look at emotions, you think, well, what's driving emotions? And you'll find a lot of it is your attention. So the mindfulness training comes in all of a sudden. So, well, let's help people gain control of their emotion, of their attention, and then apply that to an understanding pulled straight out of, psychology texts, if you like, papers, and apply it to that. So this is how it works. Are you with me? Okay. So that's what we've got, and that is basically where we're at. So we have this Cultivating Emotional Balance project, and so the research that I've started working on, or almost finished working on, so I roll my eyes as I say that, is that taking traditional contemplative approaches, mixing it with a scientific approach, right, and putting goals in place and so on, and then seeing what we find. And we're not, of course, we ran it already, and we've done the stats, and anxiety and depression all dropped and everything, which we expected. The purpose of what we're doing up there at the moment is not so much about decreasing symptoms. We're interested in the mechanisms why, which is a really big criticism of mindfulness literature. What's happening? You train people in mindfulness, for the most part, people improve. Why is that? And turns out Buddhism has some sort of theories about that. So the other part of my brief, to be here today, is that I was to demonstrate really briefly the sort of practice, the sort of thing that we're doing as part of CEB. So I'm just going to walk you through a very short meditation. So you get an idea. And keep in mind, the purpose of this, literally, when I work with people, is to help them, help you, be in control of everything you might say and do while you're emotional. Life-changing for a lot of people. So here we go. I promise this will not be long. Here's what, if you're going to meditate in a chair, and if you're going to listen to me, because it's both those things, I recommend this. Push your hips as far back as you can. These chairs are quite good for this, actually. Feet flat on the floor, so that the backrest really just supports, so your back is straight, but you're quite supported. Meditation postures should not be postures you do other things in, right? You don't want the Netflix posture, for example, right? Everyone knows what that is, right? It's okay. So, hands wherever's comfortable, but maybe on your lap is helpful, and away we go. You begin simply by scanning through the body, just a preparatory. Just release tension that you don't need as you start between the eyebrows. You just work your way down through the cheeks, throat, shoulders. Even your elbows, hands, when you get good at this, your fingers feel relaxed. Right through your thighs and your knees, your ankles and your toes. And if you feel that you've settled the body into what we call its natural state, a little bit relaxed, then now just allow your awareness to fill the body. And just without forcing it, just allow it to land on the physical sensations of breathing. Ignore your ideas and opinions about it. Just rest in on that tactile sensation of the body moving as you breathe. And as the breath flows out, and try to let it happen naturally, allow yourself to just incrementally relax a little, release the mental chatter. So every time you breathe out, you relax without losing clarity, we say. When the breath turns and comes back in, then maintain the clarity and the relaxation. Your mind will wander off, and that just makes you normal. What's quite extraordinary is you noticed and brought it back to your main task, which is attending to the physical sensations of the breath. And then, of course, you continue on another 2 hours. But in all seriousness, that's the practice that we're using. It's one of them. Very simple, taken straight out of the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Noticing when you're focused, noticing when you're not, making adjustments. There's nothing more to it than that. Right? Of course, you can go a long way with it. That was just an entry-level sort of. But you will have noticed probably that as you are trying to do it, or as you are successfully doing, even if, I should say, you are successfully doing it, you are still aware of thoughts, ideas, memories, plans for the future. It's not like the mind's quiet. Even though you're focused, there's this mental chatter in the background. In psychology, a lot of it, we like to call it task-unrelated thought, which is a cool name for it. I like this, TUT. And so it's relevant because I just, in the last few minutes, kind of explain what we've done in the research that we're working on now, and invite you to participate in the future. Here's what we've got. We have, over 8-week course, 8 90-minute classes, our intervention decreases anxiety, depression, no surprise. But what we did is we also measured on things that I had remembered as being a problem for me when I had mental health issues when I was younger, which is anxiety, rumination, and mind wandering. So we measured them on this. And what you'll find if you sort of dig into the literature a little bit, there's different types of mind wandering, there's different types of rumination. There's a sort of adaptive rumination, which is called reflective, and there's a maladaptive version called brooding. And the same is true for mind wandering. There's a spontaneous and deliberate, we call them, sort of adaptive, maladaptive types of mind wandering. And what we have found is that through the meditation practices we were doing, that the maladaptive factors drop away quite quickly. Right? Which presumably is driving a lot of that decrease in the symptoms that we saw. What is really interesting, and this is sort of the crux of what we were looking for, is that this what we call task-unrelated thought doesn't change. So over an 8-week intervention, people start with a level of task-unrelated thought, mental chatter if you like, to make it simple. And it's the same at the end, basically, it hasn't significantly changed. What has changed What's changed is the correlations. So that's to say the relationship at time 1 begins with task-unrelated thought significantly attached, if you like, to the maladaptive processes, to spontaneous mind wandering, to brooding rumination. They drop away, and what happens is the task-unrelated thought switches its allegiance and becomes correlated or related to the more adaptive types. And this we're positing as being one of the real mechanisms behind. So we've got this sort of symptomology, and mindfulness interventions seem to decrease it, which is great. And I'm thinking, well, there might be other things. How about rumination, mind wandering, and so on? Yeah, that seems to play a role too, actually, important roles. Okay. It still doesn't answer the question why, right? Why does mindfulness do this? And so this is why we look back into 2,500 years of peer-reviewed literature from the Buddhist tradition, and say it's this. It's basically what we call de-reification. It's the treating all your own mental activity as fact, right? It's treating all the thoughts, ideas, memories as being real, as being actually out there, and as an accurate reflection of reality. This is where it comes from. And what you'll find is as you increase de-reification anyway, as this mechanism changes, people switch from the maladaptive type of mind wandering to the adaptive and so on. And then that drives these other changes. So what we have here, and what I've been trying to do in the last few years of this research, and which is ongoing because we have the next stage coming up, is exactly this, is try to get these thousands of years old ideas about how the mind works, how suffering works, how happiness works, and why mindfulness should make a difference. Wrap it all up into scientific technology, into scientific terminology that we can publish and get out there in the public domain. And in that way, we're not trying to make Buddhists out of people. We're trying to sort of mine this contemplative sort of resource and bring as much stuff out of it as we can to make it absolutely relevant for people in the outside world for whom just 15 minutes a day will make a difference. I mean, more is better, but 15 minutes a day will bring about these types of changes. So my sort of finish by saying to you is the classic ending that is the classic. Whenever in the time of the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, when he was out on the town, or his disciples were cruising around the village, and people sort of said, "Hey," like they'd come up to him and say, "Hey, you look like you've got your act together. What are you up to? What's going on?" Right? And so, I mean, I'm paraphrasing. They probably spoke a little differently, but that's the sort of way they'd say, "Oh, what's up with you?" And there was one answer they always gave, right? And in Pali, it's called ehipash, and it just means come and see. They're like, just come and see. Make your own mind up, but come and see, and make sure that it's based in some sort of logic. Make sure it makes sense to you. So that would be my invitation to you in terms of the Cultivating Emotional Balance project in relation to any contemplative tradition you may be interested in, is with an open mind, with a skeptical mind, critical mind. Come and see. Thanks, Dad.